Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this very important session. We were talking amongst ourselves, and one thing we did notice is that the mainstreaming of this session as one of the first panels right after the main inaugural session, and we are very happy to note that kind of primacy is being given to this topic. We have a very distinguished panel here. We have women leaders from the field of academia, government and politics, as well as from the civil society movement. And we are hoping to have some very interesting conversations about the role of power in terms of shaping the presence and participation of women, both in the workforce and also in terms of playing important and relevant roles economically as well as socially. We also want to touch upon the necessity to create more discursive spaces where we can have these conversations in an open and respectful way to make sure that women are playing a more constructive and participatory role in both in terms of policy making and as well as in terms of delivering the right level of impact. So I do want to introduce my very distinguished panel over here. We have Pascal Fung here, who is a senior academic, and she represents the Faculty of Engineering and Computer Science from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. We have Gabriela Ramos from the OECD. She was the Sherpa at OECD Sherpa at G20 and has had a very distinguished career at the OECD. We have Wendy Sherman, comes with a long career in US government and currently is a senior counsel at Albright Stonebridge. We have Robin Gorna, who runs and leads a very important and interesting movement, global movement, which is focusing on reproductive justice, and she'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the panel. And of course, we'll have the Honorable Minister for Information and Broadcasting and Textiles, Smriti Irani, joining us. She's running a little late. She will be joining us as well. I want to kick off this session by turning to you, Pascal. One thing which we've noticed, and this is something the research and the data shows, is that the leave rates for women in STEM education as well as in science and technology is a maximum of 10 years. They will stay invested for 10 years and then they exit. Research shows that there are a variety of factors which are contributing to this: isolation, hostile work environment, lack of sponsors, and ineffective just overall management that they receive. What was interesting for us to note is that Hong Kong and the Greater China region kind of bucks this trend because you have a relatively higher percentage of women in STEM as well as in S&T education. So what are the lessons we can learn, in particular in this country, what we can learn in terms of the experiences which you've had? How did you get it right in terms of correcting that gap?
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the panel, and thank you for what you said about Greater China. So the truth is we're still fighting gender inequality in STEM in our region of the world as well. But I think, relatively speaking, Greater China has this culture of putting value on education, family culture. So parents will encourage their children to get into the fields where they can thrive. And in particular, there's a traditional notion that STEM is the most prestigious, still considered the most prestigious path to a good job. So the economic necessity of the region, because China, Hong Kong, and many of these East Asian countries not long time ago were still very poor. So the economic necessity and plus the Confucian ideal of studying really hard and then you can be somebody very much play a role. And in addition, I would say that for Chinese cultures where either your daughter, it doesn't matter your daughter or son, as long as you're the one who can lift the family out of poverty, and traditionally studying really hard, and because the education system in East Asia is very much exam-based, and the girls are doing, have traditionally done pretty well, and we do well in our exams. And that is the most important factor of social mobility. So that's very much valued, and the bright daughters of the family have to have the responsibility of lifting the entire family to the next level of economic prosperity. So that's the I think the most motivating factor. And in terms of STEM, I think a lot of parts of the world value STEM. Because it's seen as more sure path to prosperity, medical sciences or engineering. I think it's also true in India. I think the other thing that is a little different in Greater China compared to perhaps India is the lack of sexualized environment for young girls. So Chinese culture, East Asian culture, until very recently, so the pop culture is starting to change, unfortunately, which tend to sexualize young women and young girls, which I think is very, very toxic. But until recently, that is not the case. So traditionally, Chinese women do not worry about makeups and boys until much, much later. So they worry about families and studying first and so on. So it's my personal experience.
So thank you. I think it's a combination of both economic necessity as well as, sort of use that to claim prestige both within their family and society, which pushes girls to move ahead. So it's a combination of both economic considerations, but also the normative values which they want to stand for, which is leading to all of this change. And I'm sure there are lessons there for India, including very consistent values in India as well in terms of the sexualization of minors and girls that you talked about. Very similar principles there. Gabriela, I wanted to turn to you. And in your experience in OECD, you yourself have led a very important inclusion strategy and a program. Looking through all the work which you are leading, one thing I did want to check with you is that what are the areas in the domain of policy making, what are the areas which you think are working well insofar as gender issues are concerned, and where are you facing most resistance?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and good afternoon, everybody. The reality is that the gender agenda has been with us for decades. And I think it was actually in China when we had the Beijing Conference for Women. And progress is being very slow. So what at the OECD we perceive as a great push to this agenda is when we frame the issue not as a moral imperative, which it is, not as an ethical imperative, which is also a matter of empowerment of women, but we frame it as a business case. Because in all of our economies, in all of our countries, OECD and emerging economies, governments have invested a lot in educating women. School attainment has increased a lot. The years of schooling has increased a lot. So these are real investment in human capital that then go waste when you go for the labor market or for the business sector where women is completely underrepresented. So I think that has been a very great progress. And we put this issue in the agenda of the G20. And I have to tell you, when we started saying, okay, let's look at gender agenda for the G20 leaders who are dealing with the world economy. And many people look at us like saying, excuse me, are you crazy? This is nothing to do with us. Until we produce a modeling work that showed that reducing the gender gap in labor force participation of women will produce a 1% growth in all the G20 economies. So there was a fantastic case. Of course, let me tell you that it was the US Sherpa, it was the Australian Sherpa, and it was the OECD Sherpa who put the whole thing together, but we were 3 women. So we said, it's gonna look like self-serving. So we asked the Japanese Sherpa to propose it. Because actually in Japan, what is driving progress is the fact that they are in an aging society and they need to bring more women into the labor market. So I think that this building of the business case was good. It was good because also led us to understand better what are the policy areas in which we can intervene and get progress. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just about leveling the playing field. Why? Because women have special needs due to maternity issues, and because societies have decided that the role of women is to take care of children. So what do? Well, you go for better burden sharing between men and women. You go into getting for dual parental leave for men and women. So then you avoid companies and you avoid governments to discriminate women at a childbearing age. You go into investment in infrastructure for childcare facilities. You go for eliminating discriminatory laws or issues like the wage gap. I was actually surprised to see that the wage gap for equal jobs in the OECD is about 17%. In China is 55%. Why? Same jobs, same efforts, same, but you have lower remuneration. So I think these kind of equalizing policies are very important. But then there are emerging issues, even in OECD countries, and we're commenting on that. All these rules, all these infrastructure, all these policies, I think that have been advancing in all the countries, and I think that's good news. Even quotas, because one of the areas in which women are really low representation is in the business sector, where the Forbes and the CAC Current only have 5% representation of women, so quotas work when you design them in a way that is merit-based. But one of the emerging areas in which we are really concerned is violence against women. Because the reality is that we have made progress on the economic sphere, we have made progress on these policy areas, but one issue that is really worrisome in all of the advanced economies, in all of the emerging economies, is violence against women. 1 out of 4 women in advanced economies is suffering violence everywhere. So this is an area that we need to address. And then the most difficult part where I think progress has been very slow and is preventing us to make more progress on the policy field is fighting gender stereotyping and cultural norms. Because you can see it, I have to say, and I have to recognize Korea just produced a dual parental option given the most generous time frame for men to go and take care of children, 1 month. You know who take that up? 0. So it's not only about the rules, it's how do you change the cultural norms that prevent men, and I have to say that I'm very happy to see so many men in the audience, because the reality is that men are also preventing themselves from enjoying their families and their children. This is one of the areas where we really need to move. And it also impacts the question of STEM, because you are designed some roles for girls, some roles for women, and this is the expectations that build up in where you locate yourself in the economic and the social frame.
So fascinating. I found like 2 statistics fascinating. One is the fact of violence against women, how much of a universal problem it is, including even in the G7 and the G20 countries. 1 out of 4 women suffering or being subjected to violence is a terrifying statistic. I also think this entire point which you made, that men not opting to take those paternity leave, I sometimes wonder that whether is this the FOMO disease, whether it is more prevalent amongst men than in women. Obviously, I'm sure there will be some male voices who will speak to that, but I often wonder that are the victims of FOMO more than women are? But turning to you, Wendy, you did something which I was fascinated by, which is negotiating the Iran nuclear agreement. So getting into a domain of national security and strategic affairs, which almost entirely is male-dominated. And also, I think there is this attribution, there's again a stereotype, but there's an attribution that whenever technical details are concerned, where you really have to hunker down and go over technical data, and requires a lot of brain power, women normally would not be chosen for those roles because those are tough jobs. How did you deal with the environment, and also how did you break that stereotype and become part of that negotiating team?
Well, it's great to be part of this, and because we were a little delayed, we all got to have a little seminar with each other before we got to you all today, so thank you for that opportunity. I said to my colleagues here that what I wanted to most talk about here was power. How a lot of you in this audience have it, and a lot of us want it. And when you have power, it's very hard to give it up. In the times I've had power in my life, I didn't particularly want to share it or give it up. But we are at a place where we know that when girls are educated, it is the single most important factor in rising GDP. As my colleagues have said, when women are in the workforce, you get rising GDP. When women are on boards of companies, it increases the return on investment and increases sales. There's data, there's an economic backdrop to this. So if you guys want to succeed, I would urge you to share a little power because you'll get more back in return. So to go to the question that you asked, very unusual circumstance. The High Representative of the European Union organized and ran the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, in negotiations with Iran. And it was first Cathy Ashton and then Federica Mogherini. The deputy to the High Representative, Helga Schmidt, a phenomenal German diplomat, probably spent more time negotiating with the Iranians than anybody. And I led the American team, so you had the entire Iran negotiation predominantly led by women. Of course, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz on the American side, President Obama were absolutely critical and very engaged, but it was a very unusual circumstance. And one of the things that my dear friend, business partner, and former boss Madeleine Albright once taught me is that when I sit at a negotiating table, I'm not Wendy Sherman, I'm not a woman. In this case, I was not a Jewish American woman. I was the United States of America. And that's a lot of power. And I had no qualms about using that power. And I think what we women have to understand and what we have to own is not to be afraid to use that power and to take that power. Whether we are talking about sexual violence, which is very present in my own country at the moment, it's present everywhere in the world, and certainly for poor women, there are no resources, there are no ways to deal with sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual misconduct. But even wealthy women in my society, our famous actresses, our famous models, have faced now huge, huge sexual misconduct and finally can talk about it, finally can own their own power in the universe. And that is essentially what it's about. Many years ago, I started life not as a national security person, but as a social worker, as a community organizer. And I did a study many, many years ago. Women start most community organizations in the United States. It's probably true in the entire world, and they do so because they want to get a stop sign so their children can play safely, or they want to get better schools for their children, or they want to get a toilet for their child, or they want to have opportunities for their children. And as soon as money started coming into those community organizations in the United States, men somehow ended up taking over. They became the executive directors, they became the leaders, they became the presidents of the organization, and the women disappeared because it was about gaining that economic and that fundamental power. So my message to everyone in the room today is to get the best out of all of the people in our societies, to end the discrimination that exists, to end the sexual harassment, is for women to own their own power and not be afraid of it. It is not a bad and dirty thing. It's how it gets used that makes it bad and dirty and corrupt. And for men to understand that you have mothers and sisters and daughters, and you want for them what you want for yourselves, which is every opportunity there might be in the world. So please do everything you can to ensure they get it. I'll stop there.
So Wendy talked about power, and Robin, the work which you do goes to the heart of that, because you're dealing with a topic which is so fundamental to all women. It's about reproductive rights, it's about reproductive health, and we are now in an extraordinary situation, as you're sharing with me before this panel, in terms of the work which you are doing, which through via SheDecides, the initiative which you are leading and which India is going to join and which you're going to announce the program soon in a matter of few weeks. Do you want to talk about what are the challenges which you are facing now in this moment? What is your expectation from the India program and the role that we can play as a country in helping support these goals and be an example in our region and rest of the world?
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. As Wendy just said in your very beautiful intervention, we did have the great advantage of a little seminar amongst each other, and many of you have spoken to some of the really critical issues that we face in society. SheDecides was created under a year ago, and it was created by a very bold and brave political leader, Lilian Ploumen, the foreign minister of the Netherlands, and she was soon joined by many other political leaders, initially in Europe, but also in Canada, Afghanistan, increasingly a number of countries in Africa, and we hope more and more countries in Asia will see their ministers step up and join the movement, and we will be launching the first national movement here in India in March on the anniversary of the global movement being created. And what we're about is uniting that political force and community support, finding all of our creativity and energy and activism for a world where every girl and woman can decide what to do with her body, with her life, and with her future without question. And what we know is that when she decides, the world is better, stronger, safer. She decides whether, when, and with whom to have sex, to fall in love, to marry, to have children. She has the right to information, to healthcare, to choose. She is free to feel pleasure, to use contraception, to access abortion safely, to decide. Free from pressure, free from harm, free from judgment and fear. Because when others decide for her, she faces violence, forced marriage, oppression. She faces risks to her health, to her dignity, to her dreams, to her life. When she does not decide, she cannot create the life she deserves, the family she wants, a prosperous future to call her own. And we and you and he and they are uniting, standing together with her so she can make the decisions only she should make. Political leadership and social momentum are coming together like never before, but we can go further and we can do more. And from today, we fight against the fear, we right the wrongs, we mobilize political and financial support, we work to make laws and policies just, we stand up for what is right, and together we create that world that is better, stronger, safer, but only if and only when she decides. And that's our manifesto, which was written by some very talented people, and I think it expresses what's fundamental to this, and you've heard from other speakers. We want to bring women into the labour market. We know that when girls are educated, that they make massive impacts on their economies, but those things don't happen if a 14-year-old is forced into marriage. Those things don't happen when she's raped at the age of 15. Those things don't happen when she can't access contraception. Those things don't happen when she doesn't know that she's been touched at the age of 10, and so when she goes for an abortion, it's too late. We need to teach our girls and we need to teach our women. We need to make the money available for the services to be there, and we need to stop the policies that stand in the way. So why now and why India? Well, this was started a year ago because there were global policies initiated by the president in the US which damaged the ability of organizations all over the world to enable girls to decide. And countries like India have been progressive on this front. Sexual rights and reproductive justice is about economies, it is about safety, it is about security. And so we need to work with those progressive leaders to make sure that we can move forward globally to achieve a world where girls decide and women decide.
Thank you. I would like to turn to our minister here. You've traveled from education to textiles, which is like traditional manufacturing, and also now you're presiding over the information and broadcasting ministry, which has enormous communicative power, and you are sort of presiding over it and overseeing that. In your experience, as you've gone through all these roles, both as part of the cabinet and in the government, what have been your main takeaways or main experiences in terms of understanding how women are dealing with this question of participation. India's statistic, if you see 27% participation only in the workforce, if that number were to be changed, if we were to increase by 10%, our GDP would go up by double digit. I think previously you've talked about very simple steps like the universal toilet program, right, in terms of keeping back girls in school. What have been your main takeaways in terms of interventions which the government has done? And what do you see using this communicative power which you have through the Information and Broadcasting Ministry in terms of conditioning behaviors?
When I got invited to this dialogue series, the first question I asked Samir Saran was, why me again? He said, well, you're a disruptor. And I said, why am I a disruptor? He said, well, you can speak what comes to your mind, and hence you're a disruptor in administration. And then I looked at what this dialogue was all about in the brief that is available on the internet. And that brief, I, as a little experiment, gave it to 5 women who are not in administration, who are hoping to be a part of decision-making and want to be policy analysts. And I told them that read the ORF brief and then tell me what should I say today. The brief that is available online is about justifying why women should have an enhanced role in either administration or policy making. And every girl that I told to give me research came back with numbers exactly that I've heard on this dais today, telling me that women spend more on social issues, telling me that they focus a lot on education and healthcare, telling me that whenever money comes in, as Wendy said, they come in, the men come in, and then they become focused on infrastructure and big spending. But none of the 5 girls told me that women can become the focal point of an economy because they're competent. And I asked them a question in return. I said, have you ever had an opportunity in your entire adult life where you've seen 5 competent men sit on a platform and justify why they have a greater say in things? So we have 5 women here from across the world speaking for our entire gender and convincing people why women should be a bigger part of decision-making. I think that is where the entire inequality stems from. The fact that we have to explain that yes, and do a comparative that I'm as competent as a man. The fact that even in your question to Wendy, you had to say, Wendy, you were a part of a decision-making that was huge data. And you hold her in awe because she could sit there and crunch that data. And I compliment Wendy that she just sidestepped that. And she said, this is about power. It is not about data crunching. It is about being in that position and saying, I'm in this position, I speak for this office. So when you speak for that office, what comes? The fact that Gabriela had to say that they had to maneuver a gender issue in G20 speaks a lot. Because the presumption is that these deviations and movements and slide tricks happen only in emerging economies, only in economies which do not look at women as the empowered lot. The fact that at G20 table, Gabriela had to sit and strategize how to put gender ahead speaks volumes. How did the government look at servicing the gender issue? If you're looking at disruptors, the fact today that in this government, the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare has a man equally positioned as a woman to serve the needs of women and children in this country, I think that is a very big administrative disruption. Yeah. But I don't see that man on this stage today. I see all these gentlemen listening to us, but that gentleman who's in an administrative post serving the interests of women in our country is not here today. And I think that should give us a little pause for introspection, that whether we as women only identify our gender to be the problem solvers, or do we view women, men equally participative in administration of applying themselves to solutions that men and women both need in our country. When I look back at my administrative life of 3.5 years, as an administrator, not as a woman, as an administrator, I'm proud of the fact that my Prime Minister said that when you look at the basic needs of a girl going to school, she drops out of school because she doesn't have a toilet separately to go to. So he said, what has never been done in the history of our democracy, can we do it in 1 year? Can we build a toilet for a girl child in every government school in the country, but can we do it in 1 year? We build over 400,000 toilets in 1 year. That is a record for any economy in this country, in the world. And what did we see? We saw more and more girls get enrolled. Why? Because they didn't have to go home or skip school or just walk out of school just because they were getting into a period of life where they needed that facility and they wanted to shamelessly ask about it. So I think that when you're looking at tools of empowerment, these are the small stories. I have the story of this young 37-year-old tribal girl who becomes a sarpanch and says that, well, mostly the citizens that I serve come from poor families. What do I do? She looks at other aspects of administration and service, but she says, I will take a 30,000 rupee loan. I will go get everybody, men and women included, tools for farming, tools for horticulture, lease it to them, not take a government grant. This is somebody who's already in an administrative position, but understands that I will take that loan from a bank, give it to people, make them self-sufficient, and administratively, I'll focus on rainwater harvesting. For me, that tribal girl, 37 years of age, she is a hero. Because she knew that finances I'll take from a bank, pay them back, have my community empowered, but administratively, I'll look at, as a tribal leader, rainwater harvesting. Those are the fascinating stories. When we say that only look at education, only look at health because we are women, I think that is the greatest injustice we do to ourselves as competent women. And that is the greatest insult we can thrust upon a man, that you do not have the competence to look at education and health from a female perspective. I think they're equally empowered when given administrative posts. The only pathway we have to design now is how can that policy decision become gender neutral? The only decision I want as a woman today is not to be excluded from the whole process just because I'm a woman. Exclude me by all means if I'm incompetent. And I think that is the balance that we need to reach. Like Wendy said, and I clapped the loudest when she spoke, don't be afraid when you sit there and exercise that power. Don't be squeamish about it. But be equally aware that if you're incompetent, you will be kicked out, and do not use your gender as a crutch.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But we also there's also this narrative out there that there's unconscious bias, right? Like, and we see that very frequently demonstrated. There are a number of case studies on that. There's a big course which is about managing unconscious bias, because everybody has that bias, and that operates as a filter, right? Like, there are business schools which are teaching this program. In terms of future proofing, particularly in the STEM area, in the science and technology area, to build off from an initial base to take it to the next layer, particularly when you have more cutting-edge technologies like AI and other stuff coming in, how do we make sure that from a pipeline perspective, what are the set of incentives which we are creating within the STEM education fold to make sure that at least in AI and in the newer age, cutting-edge technology development area, we see greater participation by women. How are you thinking about that, Pascal?
Yeah, so I'm very grateful to have learned a lot from my co-panelists. And I would like to say that even for the field of AI, computer science, it is still about power. So let me explain. Historically, computer science is a new field. AI, only a few decades old. And historically, computer science spun off from electrical engineering. And as a software field, compared to the hardware field, which it was actually very female-dominated at the beginning. So the first computer programmers were women. and so on. And the participation of women in the field of computer science, however, peaked at around, in around 1984, where there were 37% women in computer science. And today, we have 18%. And this is from the wealthiest economies in the world. The reason being, software, so computer science as a field started to become more dominant in our economies, all right? So the boys see that they can make more money being software engineers. So it is about the economic power. So there are more men coming into computer science and driving out the women. And that's actually quite rare in STEM fields. Usually we see progress. But in computer science, we have seen a decline in participation of women, which is a very worrisome trend. And the unconscious bias in our field is similar to any other field. The only difference being, we in computer science think that we are not biased.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, in the traditional industries, people are aware of sexism, but in computer science, we think that we are merit-based, that we're actually doing very well, but the truth is the opposite. So in recent years, we finally have seen discussions about the toxic masculinity in the tech area, even in the software industry. People always thought that the male geeks, the image of the male geeks, they are more feminine and they're more open and so on and so forth. That's not the truth at all. I've studied and worked with male geeks since I was 18. And there's a different form of toxic masculinity from the kind that's what we see as the traditional masculinity. And unfortunately, in that culture, there's this, because there's no self-awareness from these male geeks, that they are actually also sexist, and very much so. And so the problem just started to be seen as a legitimate problem, the sexism in the software industry. And in AI, we have only started discussing this in recent years, and very much only in recent months, I would say. There's an active discussion on women in AI and sexism in AI in recent months. In my own field of AI, I have seen the field going from more traditionally, I don't want to say that, less traditionally masculine to more traditionally masculine. When I started in my field in the 20 years ago, I was told by people that my published papers, my kind of work is more masculine. And they were surprised always to find out when I publish my work and when I come out to speak in conferences that I'm actually a woman. Because my field has gone from, my field of natural language processing has gone from the traditional AI approach of knowledge-based and so on, expert-based, to more quantitative approach, and with recent years, more deep learning-based, machine learning-based. With that, the face of AI changed to become more masculine. And to combat that, which is, people didn't pay attention to AI. When people were not paying attention to AI, we tend to have more women. So when it becomes a very competitive field and where the money is at, then there are more men. So it's still about power. It's still about power. And so the message is still for the young girls to see role models of women in power. Not just women scientists, women geeks. That's not even the issue. Not many girls aspire to becoming geeks. They won't tell me, I want to be like you because you're a geek. I mean, that's not the reason they want to be. They want to be in the field because they see that as a tool of power, as a tool to prosperity, again, and to self-empowerment. So that's the message. And thank you for bringing that out.
Yeah, I think there is this conscious combat now against the bro code, which you talked about, because that is something which definitely Valley is very cognizant of, that this is an infection which has to be dealt with. And also, I think the role modeling point which you talked about is very critical. And there are these forums which are now being created in terms of recognizing excellence, right? And that can help in facilitating those conversations as well. Gabriela, related to the points which Pascal made, which is about the economic power being a big motivational factor, both from a modeling perspective and for young women to start getting gravitated towards these new age technologies and build a career there. You talked about the pay gaps. And I know that the OECD Gender Initiative, one of the areas which you have studied as a part of the gender initiative is also the pay gaps. How much of progress do you think the OECD countries are making? Is there anything which we need to learn from there in terms, first of all, recognizing the centrality that this is a problem which exists, that you have differentiated paychecks which are paid to men and women, and what are the best ideas in terms of having some honest conversations around that, and then making sure that we get an equal share, that women are getting an equal share of their paycheck.
Thank you, and yes, this is a fantastic panel. I'm learning a lot from everybody, and I have a comment about competencies, because that's one of the issues in which we frame also the work of the OECD. Everything is related. Why there is a wage cap? Why people doing the same job? I think it's a question of fairness. It's a question of legal standing. It's a question of recognizing that same efforts, same payment. But then it starts from the whole, as I said, the stereotyping and the roles and the biases that exist for women to have equal standing. And that's why I insist. I think that the playing field is not even, and you need to level because of this understanding of what is the role of men and what is the role of women. Wage caps starts with the fact that women choose or are expected to choose disciplines that are less rewarded in the markets. STEM disciplines usually, as you say, but you are not expected. And we have documented that because we are the organization that has the program for international student assessment that is measuring outcomes in education. But we also ask girls and we also ask families, what do they expect for their children? And usually when you ask them, do you expect your girl to go for engineering, science, mathematics? No, that's not an area for girls. And girls said no, families said no, teachers said no. What you get? Well, you get very few women going for those highly well-paid disciplines. How do you change that? It's very complex. How do you build the self-esteem that we see in this panel in all girls and all women when you are taught in the school and you are taught in the family that you should not go into those directions that are not for girls? It's just embedded in that. We have measured also that self-confidence in girls is lower. And that's dramatic, because you have the top performing girls in this instrument that we have in maths, and the top performing boys, we ask them, are you good in maths? Both of them are the top performers. 30% of girls say, yes, I am, and 60% of boys say, yes, I am. So there is this kind of social depiction of what you are meant to do in one way or another, and I think it's embedded in how you get these then economic outcomes that are in that sense. One area in which we are really concerned, because there have been many progress in terms of labor market rules and policies to allow women to get into better positions in different areas. But entrepreneurship, business sector, why women ask for less financing? This is not about men, okay? This is about women. Why women ask for less financing? And this is documented too. Or why do they have less access to financing? Why their SMEs grow slower than men? Well, because we have this question of self-confidence that is embedded in the role modeling, the expectations that societies have for women. How do you change that? It's just very difficult. And then there is this is fantastic depiction when you say, oh my God, no, these women, they don't take risks, they are not daring. But if you go with the girls that are trying to jump into a no, don't do that because you're a little girl, please behave, you should take care of you. No, you need to show them and you need to push them to be daring and to take the risk for doing those things. So this is a question of, yes, policies. This is a question of being aware that these things happen.
This is a question of providing the policy setting that will compensate for these issues. I think that there are countries like Norway, Ireland, Iceland that have just legislated that there should not be a wage gap as a legal issue. No. Yeah. There are some other countries that are more conscious in terms of looking at the economic structure to try to avoid that these things happen. There are countries that are encouraging girls to go for STEM issues. There are countries that are eliminating gender bias in textbooks. Forget about white, blue and pink and kind of role modeling for girls since the very beginning. And so there are many ways in which we can address those issues to redress the fact. But I completely agree with what my colleague in the panels have referred to. It's not a question of just looking at women or girls. I think it's a question of looking at how do we build the policies for the societies to take care of these issues. So every single person have the possibility to do whatever they want to do, to choose, I completely agree with Robin, to make the choice they want to do independently of being women or girls, and to have the chance to do it. But until we are there, I think we need policies, Minister. I think we need quotas. I have to say, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to close with this comment that I shared with my colleague panelists beforehand. Mexico legislated a quota in Congress, 50%. And now is one of the most advanced countries in that respect. We are laggards in all of the others. But in the representation and leadership, we are doing well, 50%. And I was asked to review how this has been built, because you are completely right, Minister. We need to take care of merit. We need to take care of competencies. We need to take care of those things, because you don't just want to open the door for whatever reason. But I was with the President of Congress, who happened to be a man. We have not reached that position yet. And he said, I'm very worried about this quota because we are going to be full of incompetent women. And I said, well, Mr. President, we're full of incompetent men without a quota. So I agree. We might need to have more, because we're coming from behind. We might need to do more effort to show that we're there because we deserve to be there. But the fact is that it's an uphill battle, and we still need policies to redress this situation.
Thank you. I think you made a good point, but I think you made the point about individual action also. I think women are crummy negotiators when it comes for money. We do it to ourselves. I think we need to overcome this barrier ourselves in terms, it's not really money, but it's like what kind of value which you're negotiating for, the economic value. But I do want to come to you, Minister, and ask you, what is your view on political quotas? And also, how are you, within your own political party, how are you looking at pipeline development and also attracting more younger women into politics and political organizing?
To say that putting a premium on competence means that you don't want to be gender-friendly or supportive of your gender, I think is misconstruing the background from which I'm coming. As somebody who started from the lowest economic group as an individual with 20 bucks in my pocket just a decade and a half ago, I can say this from a life experience. There are two things which I have witnessed. The Prime Minister started the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, which meant that a normal citizen wanting financial aid to develop a new business or to expand and extend existing business can take a small loan of 50,000 onwards to up to 10 lakh rupees. The only condition is that you need to draw up a business plan, go to a bank, convince the manager that your business plan makes sense and you are able to return that loan, and then take that financial aid from the banks. 75% of the beneficiaries today of that financial outreach program of the Prime Minister are women, which means that in our country, you have women coming from small towns, villages, walking up to bank managers, convincing them that their business plan makes more sense than anybody else who's walked into that same branch. And that fact that 75% of the beneficiaries of this financial agenda have women participating in such large numbers and paying back to banks, I think speaks volumes about the competence of, at least I can speak as an Indian woman, of the Indian woman today. The fact that in the organized sector, where wages and pro-labor reforms has been witnessed, the number of women compared to men is low, but in the unorganized sector, the number of women touches 90%, also speaks a different story. So when, let's say, Gabriela speaks about we are coming from behind, the question one needs to ask is, how many of us, apart from asking for an opportunity, also, once proving the competence, can ask for the price that we deserve? That's a very difficult ask, especially when you've been conditioned for years that if you ask for a little less than a man, even if you're either as competent or more competent than him, you are safer in a job. So professionally, before I was a minister or a member of parliament, I have faced a situation in my life where I've walked into my employee's room and I said, I need a raise. And the employee said, well, the guy working with you didn't get anything. And I said, well, I'm more competent and you need me in this job.
Yeah.
So what you decide for the gentleman is not my concern, but I need this raise. And the fallout of that was, I did get the raise, but other women started asking for what they wanted as well. So those are also the examples that we need to set, where you're not afraid to ask after you've proved your competence, that this is the price, or this is the package, or this is the salary I deserve. It's easier for us to say it from positions of power. It is difficult when somebody is doing a normal job. And I think that is where you need to empower women, when they can walk into a room after proving their competence and saying, I don't like this wage gap. Pay me. How many of us can embolden girls to walk in and say, this is the salary I deserve, this is the review I deserve, because I've proved I'm worthy of my job and my position, pay me. And I think that will make a huge difference. But also how we see power. Today, is power defined only by a political or administrative position? There are numbers and studies which show that a working woman and a woman who owns property, domestic violence for a working woman is much higher. And domestic violence against women who actually own property, and it's a study done in India, is only 8%. For me, even that 8% is too much.
Yeah.
But it's amazing that the power dynamics change in a family when the property and the house in which the family lives in suddenly belongs and is completely controlled by the woman. So we have to define even what is power for women across all silos, in all dynamic situations, because that is when these conversations can start. Today, we are talking about more and more girls in STEM. We are talking about more and more women in administration, policy making. We need to also simultaneously talk about what is the economic worth, what is your go-home salary, what is your financial plan where you want to own, let's say, not only a business, but also a home, a car. Because there is, and without any qualms I'm saying this, there is a little bit of hesitation, even today in our societies, where a woman says, I want to own a house before I get married. And they said, why? Shouldn't you get married first and then simultaneously either own a house or own the house later, but get married first? Yeah. So it is okay to want a bigger bank balance. It is okay to want a house, because administratively, policy-wise, you can set the agenda. But ultimately, you have to look at society to make that change, to migrate to a better place for girls and for women. So when you look at me and ask me from a political point of view, what is it that I want politically? Well, in my political organization, it is a man who said that within my political organization, 33% of spaces will be reserved for women. Yeah. I was not a woman who made that decision, it's a gentleman who made that decision. And we're the only party which said, okay, go ahead, give positions to women so that they become a part of the decision-making body as to who will get a ticket to become an MLA or an MP. And that is where empowerment begins. You begin from scratch.
And do you personally support the quota movement?
I have seen a lot of women who would otherwise not be given an opportunity to prove their competence, if not for that quota, as you say it.
affirmative action. Yeah.
Men are more afraid of me getting into that discussion because I would say, why curb me into only that much? So, like Gabriela said, well, there have been a lot of incompetent men. I haven't seen anybody crying hoarse about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, Wendy, the 2016 races were, the whole world saw what the races were. What were the lessons in terms of America getting ready for a woman president whenever that happens? Like, what's your crystal ball? Do you think the country is ready, and by when will it get ready? What are the issues? What were the learnings? You headed the Emily's list, so you have your own experience in terms of sharing some perspectives.
So it's a pleasure to have an entire conversation not mention a particular political official in my country. So I want to thank you all for that. I do want to say, though, that there has been an explosion in America. And I think with all of the challenges that we've all been talking about, which are very profound and very deep and will take time and won't happen in a linear fashion, we'll make progress and then we'll take a step back. You guys will get scared and so things won't go so well. Then we'll take another step forward and then our daughters will go further than we might have gone. So it's not forward all the way, but in part because of our election, I think you all know, and many people here were part of it in India, we had millions, billions marching the day after the inauguration in the United States. That has had a profound result in my country. Emily's List, which I once was executive director of, which is a PAC for pro-choice democratic women to run for a political office, in the prior year had 1,000 women come forward who wanted to get trained to run for elective office. As of today, they have had 23,000 women come forward who want to get trained for elective office. We have, I think, 40 women who are looking to run for Senate seats. We have hundreds of women looking to run for Congress. And I think it will be like a previous time in our history where we will have an enormous bump up in the number of women. I do not think it is an accident at all, given our election, that we have had this spotlight on sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. It has given women a sense that if they do not speak up, who will speak for them? We have had this debate this week about immigration and refugees and asylum seekers in my country, and I was on television, and I know Samir is worried about the time, so I'll go fast. But I would say the same for women. There is a very famous poem that came out of the 30s during the time of Hitler, and I sort of stole it to talk about our immigration crisis. I could steal it for women as well. In the immigration crisis, what I said was, first they came for the Salvadorans, and I did not speak up because I was not Salvadoran. Then they came for the Haitians, and I did not speak up because I was not Haitian. Then they came for the Africans, and I did not speak up because I was not African. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Yeah. So what I would say to all of us here today is that women, we have to speak up for ourselves because we cannot rely on anyone to speak for us. Men, you must speak up for your daughters and your sisters. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's my message for today. You must speak up for your daughters, your sisters, your mothers. And all of us need to speak up for each other because that is where the greatest power comes. That's where our GDP rises. That's where human rights shine. That's where there are toilets for our daughters. That is where there is education for our sons. So we have to do this together, and great things can happen. Not all at once, but great things can happen.
Yeah. We're very close to the end of our session. Robin, just one last question for you, and then we'll have to wrap. A lot of the work which you do, reproductive health, is increasingly colliding with politics. Choices coming into a position of conflict with politics. What has been your experience, and how are you going to wait and navigate this tricky, thorny issue through?
Well, I think the moment is now. What we saw last year, as you've said so clearly, we saw it very particularly in the US, but we've seen it in many countries around the world. We've started to see the injustice. If each and every one of us just thinks about this body that is yours, that you have, you expect to make your own choices about it. And the fact that so many millions and billions of young girls and women on our planet do not have that fundamental human right has become made so public over the actions of last year, over the denial of services, over preventing people and women and girls from choosing for themselves, over the fact of sexual harassment and violence becoming visible. So last year, for me, is the year when we made it very visible, when we had all our hashtags, our SheDecides, our Me Too's, our I'm Not a Cinderella. And this year must be the year where we make the change. I want to get to the end of this year where this is such a boring topic, my movement, because it's just normal. That's the social transformation we're going for, and that requires political leaders. And we've talked about men and their leadership. The day before I came here, I had the privilege of spending some time with the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, a phenomenally pro-feminist man. And, he just talks about feminism, sexual rights, reproductive justice as part of his daily life. As the vice leader of his country. We need you as men to stand up, particularly those of you with platforms and political power, to just make it normal. It shouldn't be a matter of sniggering. Sex and reproductive lives are part of all of our lives. And until we get to a point where every single human being has that control over her own body and his own body, has enough knowledge about her body that she can make choices, enough money in the system that she can access services, and laws and policies that make it easy for her to make good and healthy decisions for herself, it's that moment when our societies will change, when our economies will grow, and when she decides, and when we need to stop talking about this because our fundamental human rights will be observed. And let what happened last year be a tipping point so that we get there fast.
So thank you for being a wonderful audience, and thank you, panel, for spending an hour with us here today.